muscular. Okay. So our muscular movement occurs when chemical energy from the nutrient molecules is converted into the mechanical energy that powers the movement protein filaments within the muscle fibers. So when that movement happens, then it causes the muscle fibers themselves to contract. Then the muscle fibers contract and they'll pull on the bones to which they are attached. Therefore, that's going to cause more movement. Under the microscope, our thread-like cylindrical skeletal muscles will appear in bundles. They are going to be characterized by many different crosswise stripes and multiple nuclei. Each fine thread is going to be a muscle cell, usually called muscle fiber. This type of muscle tissue has three different names. Skeletal muscle, because it attaches to the bone. Striated muscle, because of its cross stripes or its striations. And then voluntary, because its contractions can be controlled voluntarily. In addition to the skeletal muscle, the body also contains two other types of muscle tissue. We have cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. So the bulk of the heart, that's going to be made up of cardiac muscle. Fibers within that type of muscle will also be cylindrical, but they will branch frequently, and then they'll merge into a continuous mass of interconnected tissue, almost as if it were woven together. Similar to the skeletal muscle fibers, the cardiac muscle fibers have cross striations. So underneath a microscope, they do have staining bands that are cross sections of the intercalated disc, where the plasma membranes of the adjacent cardiac fibers connect to one another. The interconnected nature of the fibers will help the tissue to contract as a unit and increases the efficiency of the heart's muscle when pumping its blood. Smooth muscle fibers are going to be tapered at each end, and they have a single nucleus. So because they lack cross stripes or striations, they are sometimes called non-striated muscle fibers. They have a smooth and even appearance when viewed through a microscope, and they're called involuntary because we normally do not have control over their contraction. Smooth muscle. My heater is making funny noises. Let me get it turned off real quick. Smooth muscle or involuntary muscle will form an important part of the walls of our blood vessels, and then many of the hollow internal organs, such as the gut, the urethra, and the ureters. Because of its location in many visceral structures, it's sometimes also called visceral muscles. A skeletal muscle, that's going to be an organ that's composed mainly of skeletal muscle fibers and connective tissues. Fibrous connective tissue wraps around each individual muscle fiber and then continues as it wraps around groups of muscle fibers called fascicles. Then it will wrap around the entire muscle organ. And fascia is going to be the loose connective tissue that's outside the muscle organs that form a flexible, sticky packing material between the muscles, bones, and the skin. Most of our skeletal muscles attached to two bones have a movable joint between them. So in other words, most of our muscles will extend from one bone across a joint to another bone. One of the cheekbones is usually more stationary during a given movement than any other. The muscle's attachment to the more stationary bone, that's called its origin. Its attachment to the more movable bone is called the muscle's insertion. And the rest of the muscle itself is going to be called the body of the muscle. Tendons will anchor muscles firmly to bones and are made up of dense fibrous tissue that connect or that will extend from the muscle that we described earlier. In the shape of heavy cords or broad sheets, tendons are going to have great strength. So therefore, they will not tear or pull away from the bone very easily. Small fluid-filled sacs called bursa will lie between some tendons and the bones beneath them. The small connective tissue are going to be sacs that are lined with synovial membranes that secrete a slippery lubricating fluid that fills the bursa. Like a small flexible cushion, a bursa reduces friction and makes it easier for a tendon to slide over a bone when the tendon's muscles shorten. So tendon sheaths and will also go over some tendons. So because these tube-shaped structures are also lined with synovial membranes, and they will also moisten with synovial fluid, like they tend to have with a bursa in order to facilitate that body movement. Skeletal muscles, the tissue itself is going to consist of elongated contractile cells or muscle fibers that look like long tubes of cylinders. Their flexible fibers, their flexible connective tissue wrappings will hold them together in parallel groups and allowing individual muscle fibers to pull together in the same direction as a team. Each skeletal muscle has a unique cytoskeleton structure, and the fiber's internal framework is going to be organized into many long cylinders. Each of those made up into, with each of those will be made up of two kinds of threads that are like microfilaments. Those are going to be called thick and thin microfilaments. So the thick microfilaments are going to be formed from a protein called myosin, and then the thin filaments are going to be composed mainly of a protein called actin. Sarcomeres, which are going to best be described as basic functional or contractile units of our skeletal muscle. The submicroscopic structure of a sarcomere will consist of numerous thick and thin myofilaments that are arranged so that when they are viewed under a microscope, they have dark and light stripes or cross variation. Those repeating units or sarcomeres are going to be separated from each other by dark bands called Z-lines or Z-discs. When sarcomeres are in a relaxed state, the thick and thin filaments, which will go parallel over each other, they will somehow overlap. The contraction of a muscle will cause two types of myofilaments to slide towards each other, which will then shorten the sarcomere and then the entire muscle group. When the muscle is relaxed, the sarcomeres remain at their resting length, and then the filaments remain at their resting position. Sorry, it's getting ready to rain. I was looking to see how bad it was going to be. One of the tremendously important functions of skeletal muscle contractions is going to be to produce body movement. Muscle moves bones by pulling on them. Because the length of the skeletal muscle can shorten as its fibers contract, the bones to which the muscle attaches moves closer together. So as a rule, only the insertion bone will move. As the muscle body contracts, shortens, and pulls the insertion bone towards the origin bone, then the arm is going to be abducted. By remembering the simple rule, they can help you understand the most muscle action. Voluntary muscle movement is going to normally be smooth and free of jerks and tremors because skeletal muscles will work together in coordinated teams rather than individually. Several muscles will contract while others relax to produce almost any movement that you can imagine. Of all the muscles contracting simultaneously, the one that's mainly responsible for producing a particular movement, that's known as the prime mover. Any other muscles that help in producing the movement are called your synergist muscles. As prime movers and synergist muscles at a joint will contract, then they will produce a movement opposite to that of the prime movers and the prime mover synergist muscles. So we're able to maintain our body position because of a continuous low strength muscle contraction called muscle tone or tonic contraction. Because relatively few of a muscle fiber shorten at one time in a tonic contraction, then the muscle as a whole will not shorten and no movement will occur. Consequently, our tonic contractions will not move any body parts. They do hold muscles in position, however. In other words, our muscle tone will maintain posture, and good posture means that the body parts are held in positions that best favor function. These positions will balance the distribution of weight and therefore put the least strain on muscles, tendons, ligaments, and bones. Our healthy survival depends on our ability to maintain a stable body temperature. A fever or elevation in bone and body temperature of only a degree or two above 98.6 degrees is almost always a sign of illness, just as a serious fall in our body temperature. Any decrease below a normal, any decrease below normal, which is a condition called hypothermia, will drastically affect the cellular activity and normal body function. The contraction of muscle fibers will produce most of the heat that is required to maintain our body temperature. If the muscle fibers are stimulated repeatedly without adequate periods of rest, then the strength of the muscle contraction decreases. Therefore, it will result in fatigue. If repeated stimulation occurs, the strength of the contraction continues to decrease, and eventually the muscle loses its ability to contract. During exercise, a small amount of ATP required for muscle contraction is quickly depleted. Formation of more ATP results in the rapid consumption of oxygen and nutrients, often outstripping the ability of the muscle's blood supply to replenish them. When oxygen supplies run low, the muscle fibers switch to a type of energy conversion that does not require oxygen. This produces what's known as lactic acid, and it may contribute to the burning sensation in muscles during exercise. The simple term oxygen debt describes the continually increasing metabolism that must occur in a cell in order to remove the excess lactic acid and accumulate during our prolonged exercise. And then labored breathing after the cessation of exercise is required to pay the debt of oxygen that is required for the metabolic effort. So remember that muscles will not function alone. Other structures such as bones and joints must function along with them, and most skeletal muscles cause movement by pulling on bones across movable joints. However, the respiratory, circulatory, nervous, muscular, skeletal systems, all of those will play a central role in producing normal movement. The fact has a great practical importance. For example, a person might have a perfectly normal muscle and still not be able to move normally. They may have a nervous system disorder that shuts off the impulses to a certain skeletal muscle, resulting in paralysis. Multiple sclerosis is going to act in this way, but so do other conditions such as a brain hemorrhage, a brain tumor, or a spinal cord injury. So before a skeletal muscle can contract and move a bone, the muscle must first be stimulated by nerve impulses. Muscle fibers are stimulated by a nerve cell called a motor neuron, and any single motor neuron can stimulate more than one muscle fiber. However, each muscle fiber communicates with only one motor neuron. The point of contact between the nerve ending and the muscle fiber is called the neuromuscular joint. So keep in mind that the motor neuron and muscle fiber membranes never actually touch, as there's going to be a fluid matrix that's found between them. A single motor neuron with muscle fibers that innervates is called a motor unit. So in our bodies, we have both small and large motor units. Small motor units, in our small motor unit, a given motor neuron controls only a few muscle fibers. So small motor units are common in the eye muscles, and therefore they will offer precise control. In large motor units, a given motor neuron will control hundreds, maybe thousands of muscle fibers. So large motor units are going to be common in the thigh, and they are going to be activated in high intensity activities. In a lab setting, a single muscular fiber can be isolated and subjected to a stimuli of varying intensities so that it can be studied. Such experiments show that a muscle fiber does not contract until an applied stimulus reaches a certain level of intensity. The minimal level of stimulation required to cause a fiber to contract is called the threshold stimulus. When a muscle fiber is subjected to a threshold stimulus, then it will contract completely. On the other hand, if a threshold stimulus is not reached, the muscle will not contract. Because of this, muscle fibers are said to respond in an all or none manner. However, a muscle is composed of many muscle fibers that are controlled by different motor units, and they will have different threshold stimulus levels. Although each muscle fiber in a muscle, such as the biceps brachii, will respond when subjected to a threshold stimulus, and the muscle as a whole does not. A twitch, that is going to be a jerky, quick response to a stimulus. So twitch contraction can be seen in isolated muscles during research, but they will play minimal role in our muscle activity. To accomplish the coordinated and fluid muscular movements that are needed for most daily tasks, muscles must first contract in a coordinated, smooth, and sustained way. Unlike a twitch, a tetanic contraction is more sustained and unsteady. It is produced by a series of stimuli that are bombarding the muscle in rapid succession, and contractions blend together to produce a sustained contraction or tetany. After about 30 stimuli per second, for example, that will evoke a tetanic contraction in certain types of our skeletal muscle. Tetanic contractions are not necessarily a maximal contraction in which each of those muscle fibers respond in the same time. In most cases, only a few groups of muscle fibers will undergo contractions at any one time. Our isotonic contraction of muscle will produce movement at a joint. With this type of contraction, the muscle changes in length at the insertion and moves relative to the point of origin. There's going to be two different types of isotonic contractions. One will be concentric contraction, in which the muscle shortens, and the other is going to be known as eccentric contraction, in which the muscle lengthens, but it will still provide work. For example, if you lift your book, that requires concentric contraction of the biceps muscle that flexes your elbow. When you lower the book safely and slowly, it will require eccentric contraction of the biceps muscle. And that's what we call muscle contraction, that really refers to the generation of force by the muscle, whether it shortens or not. Contraction of a skeletal muscle does not always produce movement. Sometimes it increases the tension with muscle without changing the length of the muscle. So when the muscle contracts and no movement results, it is called an isometric contraction. The word isometric comes from the Greek word that means equal measure. So therefore, a muscle length during an isometric contraction and during relaxation is about equal. Although muscles do not shorten during isometric contractions, tension will increase. Because of this, our repeated isometric contractions make muscles grow larger and stronger up to a point. Pushing against the wall or other immovable objects, that's going to be a good example of an isometric exercise. Although no movement occurs in the muscle, it does not shorten, and therefore its internal tension increases dramatically. So we all know that exercise is good for us. Some of the benefits of regular, properly practiced exercise will include improved muscle tone, better posture, more efficient heart and lung function, less fatigue, and then looking and feeling better. Skeletal muscles undergo changes that correspond to the amount of work that they normally do during prolonged activity. Muscles will typically shrink in mass. And then a condition called disuse atrophy will happen. Exercise, on the other hand, may cause an increase in muscle size called hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy can be enhanced with strength training, which involves contracting muscles against heavy resistance. Isometric exercises and weightlifting are going to be common strength exercises. This type of training will result in an increased number of myofilaments in each muscle fiber. And then although the number of muscle fibers stays the same, the increased number of myofilaments greatly increases as the mass of the muscle. Endurance training, also called aerobic training, does not usually result in muscle hypertrophy. Instead, this type of exercise program will increase the muscle's ability to sustain a moderate exercise over a long period of time. Aerobic exercises such as running, bicycling, or other primary isotonic movements will increase the number of blood vessels in a muscle without significantly increasing its size. This increase of blood flow allows a more efficient delivery of oxygen and glucose to our muscle fibers during exercise. Aerobic training also causes an increase in the number of mitochondria within those muscle fibers. It will then allow for the production of more ATP, which is then needed to fuel those prolonged activities. The particular type of movement that occurs at any of the joints will depend on the muscles acting at that joint on or I'm sorry, on their origin and insertion points. It will depend on the shape of the bone involved as well as the joint type. Muscles acting on some joints produce movement in several directions, whereas those acting on other joints will produce only limited movement. Flexion is going to be a movement that decreases the angle between the two bones of their joint, and then it's often described as that bending movement. So if you bend your elbow or your knee, then you flex it. Extension movements are going to be the opposite of that. They will increase the angle between the two bones of their joint. Therefore, the extension is a straightening or stretching movement rather than a bending movement. Abduction means that it is moving a part away from the midline of the body, such as moving your arm out to your side. And then again, that adduction, that refers to moving a part toward the midline, such as bringing your arms down to your side. Rotation, again, is that movement around a longitudinal axis. So you rotate your head and neck by moving your skull from side to side, as in shaking your head no. Circumduction, that'll move apart. So that is going to be a distal end that moves in a circle. So when you picture one that throws a ball, they're going to circumduct their arm. Supination and pronation are going to refer to hand positions that result from the rotation of the forearm. So supination results in a hand position with the palm towards the anterior position. And then pronation is when you turn the palm of your hand so that it faces posteriorly. Some of your body parts, such as the foot, are going to be difficult to describe with ordinary terms. So therefore, we are going to have special terms that are often used to describe those unique movements. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion will refer to those ankle movements. So dorsiflexion, or the dorsum, or the top of the foot, is going to be elevated with the toes pointing upward. And then your plantar flexion is going to be where the bottom of your foot is directed downward, as if you were standing on your toes. Inversion and eversion, those are also going to be ankle movements, where inversion turns an ankle so that the bottom of the foot faces towards the midline of the body. And then your eversion is going to turn the ankle in the opposite direction so that the bottom of the foot faces away from the midline of the body. All right, so some of our pathology for the muscular system, we have our different fibers, fascia, and tendons. So if you ever hear anyone say that they have fasciitis or that plantar fasciitis, that's going to be the inflammation of a specific fascia. Your tendonitis, that's going to be another big one that we'll see. It's just the acute inflammation or irritation of the tendon. So typically, if you use it too much, or if you don't use it a lot and then you do use it, that'll result in the tendonitis. Tendinosis is just going to be that chronic condition that's characterized by pain that's caused by repetitive overuse or an injury that's not healed. Some muscle disorders that we'll see, Atrophy is going to be when there's weakness or wearing away of those muscles or those body tissues and structures. Hernia is going to be when you have that tissue that protrudes through a weak area in the muscle that typically does contain it. Most of the time, you'll have inguinal hernias or abdominal hernias, especially after abdominal surgeries. And then the other one is that myalgia. That's just going to be a tenderness or pain in the muscles. That's a pretty generalized term, but you will see that one quite a bit. When we talk about muscle tone, something that is atonic, then it just lacks that normal muscle or the strength. Dystonia is going to be just a movement disorder. Sometimes it's those involuntary, and sometimes they're repetitive contractions of certain muscles. And then hypotonia is just going to be a diminished tone of those skeletal muscles. As far as muscle movement pathology, you've got contractures, which are just basically permanent tightening of those muscles, tendons, ligaments, or even your skin. Intermittent claudication, that is going to be poor circulation in the leg that does cause pain during exercise, but it does, it is relieved by stress or by rest, not stress, rest. Your cramps, those are just going to be your painful localized muscle spasms. So you'll have like your menstrual cramps or even your Charlie horses or your leg cramps. Bradykinesia versus dyskinesia and hyperkinesia. So Brady, that is coming from our med term. So Brady just means slow. Dyskinesia just means that it is fragmented or jerky movement. So it's not going to be that smooth movement. And then your hyperkinesia, that is just going to be an abnormally increased muscle function or activity. So again, they're not going to be smooth movements at all, but they're not as fragmented or jerky as that dyskinesia. Repetitive stress disorders, you've got your compartment syndrome. So you'll have some swelling that does happen within those muscles that will compress those nerves and blood vessels. You have overuse injuries and overuse tendonitis. Trigger fingers. I think a lot of us, have had a trigger finger at one point. Sometimes they will go away very quickly. Sometimes they'll last for a little bit. So you've just got that painful progressive restriction of movement. And then our rotator cuff injuries that you'll see down there at the bottom, impingement syndrome, just basically it's that rotator cuff tendonitis. It could also be referred to as tennis shoulder or swimmer's shoulder. Your carpal tunnel syndrome, I'm struggling with mine at the moment. Basically, if you work on the computer, those repetitive movements when that carpal tunnel and those tendons are used on a repetitive basis, they do become swollen and inflamed. And then eventually it just creates pressure on that nerve. And it causes sometimes tingliness, numbness. You even get like almost like a heat type of sensation in your fingers. Your ankle and foot problems, your heel spurs, plantar fasciitis. If you've ever been blessed with either one of those, you know that blessed is not the right word. But it is, just inflammation of that plantar fascia on the sole of the foot for that plantar fascia. And then our sports injuries. So we have soft tissue injuries that can happen to just skin, muscles, ligaments, and tendons. You've got your sprains, your strains, things along those lines. Hamstring injuries, where whenever the muscles contract too quickly and then you try to move. And then your Achilles tendonitis is just inflammation of that Achilles tendon. Your spinal cord injuries, you can have a piece of a broken vertebrae that presses into the spinal cord that actually will cause you to lose sensation. It can cause some types of paralysis depending on the level of the vertebrae that's closest. to the injury, and then it can be complete or incomplete. So is there a complete loss of that sensation, or is it just something below the normal function? And then as far as your paralysis goes, myopresis is just going to be a weakness or slight muscle paralysis. Hemipresis is just one side of the body. Um, or I'm sorry, hemipresis is going to be a weakness or slight paralysis of one side, whereas hemiplegia is going to be your total paralysis of one side of the body. Versus your paraplegia, which is of both legs and the lower part of the body, and then quadriplegia is all four extremities. And then our word roots that we have are going to be myo for muscle, musculo as well for muscle. Ano is going to be for fiber, so not necessarily the fiber that you inject, but your muscle fibers themselves. Fascio is going to be for fascia. Teno is for tendon. Tono is for tone, so something that's cardiotonic is strengthening action of that heart muscle. So it's toning up that heart muscle. And then kino is movement. So kinesis just means that it is movement.